All right, Nahum chapter 1. So, Nahum was, if you got your handout, you can kind of see some of this. We do have more of a specific date for Nahum. In chapter 3, verse 8, you have, let's see, somebody read that for me. Nahum chapter 3, verse 8. You have kind of a date, sort of a marker to help us to kind of figure out the date. Somebody read that, Nahum chapter 3, verse 8.
Are you better than Nahum, which was situated by the waters of the Nile, with water surrounding her, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall consisted of the sea?
What did your version say? No, Amen?
Yeah.
What does somebody else's version say there? Just Thebes, okay. Oh, it's got a footnote thing? Yeah. So that happened in 663 BC, roughly. And then the fall of Assyria, you could kind of put that around 612 BC. That's whenever Babylon really started taking over. Eventually taking the first wave of captives in Jerusalem into Babylonian captivity, like 606 years before Christ, basically. So this kind of puts the writing of Nineveh, or at least Nineveh's life, between 663 and 612. Now, notice again, I said that puts Nahum's, what did I say, Nineveh? Are we going to have another Nona incident from last week? I kept saying Nona instead of Jonah. This puts Nahum's life somewhere around in there. Now, that doesn't mean that the prophetic book was written during that time. Somebody later could have written down the oracles or compiled his oracles into one manuscript. And all of those, by the way, were compiled into the Book of the 12. While we typically think of the minor prophets as 12 separate books, the Hebrew Bible was composed in such a way to make them one book, to make them one unit. And so you wouldn't really read them separately, you would read them as a unit, right? And so they would interpret each other and have conversations with each other, right? The books themselves. The books, you could view them as being in dialogue with each other, one offering a particular point of view and the other maybe giving some nuance or maybe even giving some light critique or questions about that point of view. And this happens throughout the Bible, but we are especially going to see that today in the minor prophets. There's a couple of things we could point out about this too that I put on your handout here. Nahum's name means comfort, which is pretty interesting, considering that his book is probably one of the most ferocious, you might say, of all the minor prophets. Whereas the other minor prophets oscillate between destruction and hope, as we've already seen in Hosea and Amos and Micah. Nahum is, towards Assyria, basically 100% negative. He has some passages of hope and restoration for Judah, but as for the nation of Assyria and the city of Nineveh, there's not much good said about them. And there's nothing good said about them, in fact. In fact, the language used to describe Nahum's fall is not something that you'd probably want to study in a kid's Sunday morning Bible school. Even Jonah, we use that as like a kid's story, but we saw how that was actually a grown-up story, in the last couple weeks with Jonah. But Nahum is definitely one of those that it's got some pretty graphic language, some rated R kind of language, as we'll see in a little bit. Nahum is also going to feature what we might call apocalyptic language. The word apocalypsis in Greek is where we get the name of the book Revelation. And so you might consider apocalyptic language as any language that kind of reminds you of Revelation. In fact, if you look at your chart on the back where it talks about the New Testament use of the Old Testament, on the left column, upper half, you'll have there a reference actually to Nahum can be found in Revelation 6:17. So this book is cited about 4 times, give or take, in the New Testament. I'm actually going to give some more ideas on that next week, but this week we're just kind of doing the book of Nahum as the book of Nahum, and we'll worry about kind of the New Testament's use of this book later on. Okay. Well, with that being said, let's just go ahead and hop into this book. Does anybody have any questions or anything, though, before we get going? We're all kind of on the same-ish page? Okay, somebody read for us then. Nahum chapter, I'm in chapter 3. Nahum chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Nahum 1, 1 to 3.
The burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Equishite. God is jealous, and the Lord revengeth. The Lord revengeth and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserveth wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. He will not at all equate the wicked. The Lord hath his way with the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, an oracle concerning Nineveh. Now, why does Nineveh stand out to you here at the beginning of Nahum? It's where Jonah went, right? Now, I want you to notice verse 3 to begin with here. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. Does that verse seem familiar to you?
James, slow to anger, quick to...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be a good cross-reference there. Yeah, James being slow to anger, quick to hear, quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Yeah. Here's one for you. Jonah chapter 4. Jonah chapter 4, Jonah is upset because God is going to spare Nineveh. And this made Jonah very displeased and very angry. And in verse 2, Jonah says basically, well, God, this is why I didn't want to go to Nineveh anyways. He says, for I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from punishment. All right? Now notice the difference between Jonah 4, verse 2, and Nahum chapter 1 and verse 3. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty, whereas in Jonah 4, a little bit different there, he said that God was slow to anger, and then he was relenting in his punishment. So you have two different statements by two different prophets that kind of have a different feel to them. So I just want you to notice already the tension between these two books. One book is about Nineveh's salvation. In fact, it's a salvation that Jonah expected and anticipated because of his view of the character and nature of God. A view of the nature of God, which came from God's self-disclosure to Moses on Mount Sinai way back in the book of Exodus. Remember, whenever God passed passed by the cleft of the rock, as we read last week. Here in Nahum, though, whenever he talks about God's relationship to Nineveh, there's none of this, full of grace and mercy and long-suffering and relenting from punishment and things like that. Instead, he says, the Lord is slow to anger, but it's like he's, going to kind of modify that, but he's great in power, and he'll by no means clear the guilty. So yes, Nineveh, God is slow to anger. However, don't forget, God's also a powerful God. So there's there's some tension between what we learned in Jonah and what we're reading in Nahum. Let's look back at verse 2 one more time. Look at the characteristics of God here. Jealous and avenging, verse 2. Avenging and wrathful. And then the Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and prolongs it against his enemies. So notice how vengeance there is used 3 different times. Avenging, and then vengeance. What's your ideas on this kind of threefold repetition of vengeance here at the beginning of Nahum?
Hebrew writers would often use a word a certain number of times, and they would pick a very significant number, like 3 or 5 or 7 or 10, and they would repeat it that many times within their passage intentionally to indicate, hey, this is what I'm talking about here, pay attention. Like Paul constantly uses the term comfort, or Peter, anyway. Well, New Testament books constantly says comfort over and over and over, and if modern writing instructor were to grade that'd be like you're using too much repetition. But they did that back in those days, and so a threefold repetition is significant.
And that's kind of what we see in translations, if a word is repeated a lot, the translators will kind of give different offerings. They'll translate it different ways to try to, make it flow better in our English or what kind of we expect. But as Josh says here, repetition was key. It was important. It's something we got to watch out for. Tina? Oh, I thought you. Oh, you dropped your glasses? Oh, okay. All right. All right, so we have vengeance 3 times here in verse 2. Bad news. This is bad news for Assyria. But it's very good news for Judah, as we're going to see here in a little bit. Last passage we saw, though, his way is in the whirlwind and storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. Okay, God's way being in the whirlwind and storm. Does that remind you of a story in the Hebrew Scriptures?
When God spoke to Moses out of the whirlwind.
What? Oh.
Well, to me, it even reminds me of Jonah.
How does it remind you of Jonah?
His way being in the storm. Once he was thrown off the ship into the ocean, that's when Jonah started coming back to God and repenting.
Yeah, that's a good connection. I didn't think about that. Anybody else have anything to add to that? God's way being in the storm, connecting that back to Jonah?
We're on the topic of opposing viewpoints, like Nahum.
Yeah.
James and Paul. There's an interesting passage. Was it Elijah or Elisha where there was the cloud that appeared and God wasn't there? And then it was a still small voice.
That's where I was going. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. So in 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah was pretty upset because he was the only one left in Israel that was faithful, at least according to his perspective. And so God brings him up to the mountain. He actually goes there, by the way, for 40 days and 40 nights. That's how much food he brought. And whenever God comes to him and he says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah says, "Well, I'm very zealous for the Lord because the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." And then God tells Elijah, this is 1 Kings 19, verse 11 now, to go stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, again, same thing you just said a second ago. So in this story, Josh brings up that while Nahum found God in the wind, Elijah couldn't find God in the strong wind, in the fire, or in the earthquake. Instead, God's voice spoke out of the silence, perhaps a soft voice, as some translations talk about. And so again, we have this kind of different ways of viewing God, different ways of talking about God. And all of these, of course, remember, the Bible is inspired by God, but there's a severe limitation with Scripture, and that is that human language can never capture the essence of the divine perfectly, right? Human language as it is, it's always going to fall short. Whenever Jesus stands and looks over Jerusalem and he says, "How often I wanted to gather you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings," obviously, that falls a little short of describing God's love for Jerusalem, right? Even though it's beautiful, it's poetic, it's maybe even kind of funny to think about, because if you've ever seen chickens run around, that's kind of an image of chaos it could be. But anyways, the what?
And God's being compared to a hen.
Yeah, it's very silly. But human language can only go so far. And so here in Nahum, we have a view of God in the wind, whereas when Elijah, he didn't experience God in the wind. Elijah needed the small, still voice, I reckon, at that moment. All right, any other thoughts on these first 3 verses of Nahum chapter 1? Josh?
I think what the passage about Elijah is trying to do is, along with many other passages similar, is to contrast the concept of the supreme God with the concepts of the pagans had about their supreme God. And typically in the pagan world, especially in the Canaanite world, the supreme pagan God, which they had a concept of, the concepts are very similar between the Hebrew Bible and the pagan gods in some ways. They all agreed that there was a single God at the very top. And typically that single God was the God over what was highest in the sky that befell humanity. That could be plagues, it could be lack of rain, or it could be thunderbolts, like you see with, and sometimes in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as Zeus. But anyway, this idea of a God who, is in the clouds is both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the pagan world. So they would have understood this very well. We don't think about God that much that way anymore, but they did.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, let's keep going. Verse 5. Let's skip down to verse 5, I should say. All right, the mountains quake before him, the hills melt, the earth heaves before him, the world and all who live in it. Okay, so in describing the destruction of Assyria, somebody's playing basketball. That's the kind of sound you hear then. In describing the destruction of Nineveh, in particular, Assyria in general, he depicts it as the destruction of the world, the destruction of the cosmos, the earth melting, the mountains melting, the earth moving out of its place, the world and all who live in it perishing. Do y'all recognize that kind of language? That pops up all over the place in the prophets, right? Old Testament and New Testament. You might be familiar from the book of Matthew, where Jesus talks about, the stars are going to fall from the sky, and the heavens and earth are going to be shaken, and the sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon will be turned to blood. This kind of decreation language, this destruction of the world language, is pretty typical in the prophets to describe the upheaval of nations. And I think that's kind of what we're getting. We're getting here in Nahum chapter 1 as well. Let's keep going. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and by him the rocks are broken in pieces. The Lord is good, a stronghold in a day of trouble. He protects those who take refuge in him. Even in a rushing flood, he'll make a full end of his adversaries, and he'll pursue his enemies into darkness. So in Nahum, how does God protect those who take refuge in him? How does God protect those who take refuge in him? By doing what? According to verse 8.
By punishing their enemies, attacking them.
Yeah, by punishing their enemies, by attacking them, by making a full end of his adversaries. In the book of Jonah, how does God subdue Israel's enemies?
Sends one prophet.
He sends one prophet, and what does that prophet do? The what? Well, he did go the other way at first, but what does he eventually do? And through his preaching, remember what happened in Nineveh? Yeah, everybody from the king to the cows repented. Literally. They put sackcloth. I mean, I don't know if it was literally, but, in the story, they put sackcloth on the cows. Kind of interesting. So in Joshua's day, not that Josh, but different Josh. In Joshua's day, when he came across the Jordan River, Ark of the Covenant, splitting the sea, drying it up, how did he conquer the Promised Land? Through what means? Through battle, right? Kind of what we're reading about in Nahum. In a different Joshua's day, this is, Jesus' name and Joshua's name are the same thing, right? It's like a translation difference. But so when this Joshua comes, and he goes into the Jordan River to be baptized, and he comes up and he goes to Jericho, what does he do? Instead of knocking down the walls and killing all those inside, what does Jesus do to Jericho? I think he healed a blind man on the way there, and he preached the good news. He was a prophet, and he brought salvation. So Nahum, when he goes into Assyria, so to speak, figuratively through his prophecy, he's going for destruction, to put them down, to destroy God's adversaries. And Jonah, though, when he goes into Nahum, quoting the same passages, the Lord is slow to anger, like we saw in Jonah chapter 4, he's going for salvation, to bring repentance. Now, Jonah, he probably would have rather preached the book of Nahum, right? Jonah would have rather walked up in there with a sword in his hand, saying, "Yeah, God's going to destroy you, and I can't wait to see it." But instead, he ended up being more like the one who also went into the heart of Hades for 3 days and three nights, so to speak. Okay, let's keep going here, verse 9 through 11, and then we're going to skip around a little bit more. All right, so somebody read 9 through 11 for me, please. 9 through 11.
What do you plot against the Lord? He will make a complete end. Trouble will not rise up a second time, for they are like entangled thorns, like drunkards as they drink. They are consumed like stubble fully dried. From you came one who plotted evil against the Lord, a worthless counselor.
All right. Now notice he says in Nahum that they will not rise up how many times? They will not rise up twice? Yeah, they won't rise up a second time. In other words, once they're gone, right? That's the idea. Okay, keep your place in Nahum. Go to Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah chapter 19. Now, Isaiah chapter 19, verses 1 through 17, is very similar to Nahum in that the prophet Isaiah is prophesying against the Egyptians. Same kind of imagery is used, in fact. Do you remember that passage in Nahum that said that the clouds are the dust of God's feet? Yeah. And in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, God is also pictured as riding on a swift cloud to come to Egypt. In Isaiah 19, verse 1. It also talks about their hearts melting and their spirit being emptied out, and how the Egyptians would be delivered into the hands of a hard master, and all these sorts of things, and how the waters would dry up in verse 6. So there's a lot of similarities between the destruction of Egypt in Isaiah 19 and the destruction of Assyria in Nahum chapter 1. But look at this in verse. We could read a lot of this, but we don't really have as much time. Let's just go skip down to verse 22. Here we go. Somebody read 22 through 25, if you could. 22 through 25.
Still in Isaiah.
Isaiah 19, 22 to 25.
And the Lord shall smite Egypt. He shall smite and heal it. And they shall return even unto the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. In that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians.
Serve how? Let's keep reading.
In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt, and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance.
All right, so how about that? In a prophecy about the destruction of Egypt, God says, well, I'm actually going to strike Egypt, but in striking them, I will heal them. And eventually, I'm going to bring about the reconciliation, not just of Egypt, but also of Assyria. And not only that, he says, it almost comes in as an afterthought, in a way. Verse 24, on that day, Israel will be the third party with Egypt and Assyria. It's like, I'm going to restore Egypt and Assyria, and yeah, maybe Israel too. It's almost like this prophet of Israel is trying to make a point, about God's grace. And in this way, God's going to bless. Notice he calls Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my heritage. Isaiah is using language typically that you would associate with blessings of Israel. He uses that concerning Assyria and Egypt. So it's really, really odd. You raise your hand?
That was when you finish your thought.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
This is really radical language.
Yeah.
For people of the time. It would be like telling a first century Jew that God is also going to save the Samaritans. Or telling somebody now, an Alabamian now, that God's going to save the Mississippi.
Right, yeah.
Zechariah does the same thing. And by the way, in the Torah, you read, like in Nahum, how, the Canaanites are evil, wipe them out, kill every man, woman, and child. But there's this hint of something that Isaiah and Zechariah both bring out. So Egypt and Syria were the two major superpowers at the time. So Isaiah picks those, and God's going to save a remnant of them. That's weird.
Yeah.
By the way, there's also a prophecy that God would build a temple in Egypt, which actually ended up happening if it hasn't been. But anyway, Zechariah actually talks about God preserving a remnant of certain Canaanites In fact, very much hated ones, such as the Philistines and the Jebusites. Which it sounds bizarre if you think about who those people were.
Yeah.
But he did, in fact, do that in this narrative.
It is interesting. I mean, it is how the people that were considered Israel's most hated enemies are often the ones who are objects of restoration in the prophecies. In fact, when you study the life of Jesus, and the text says, and Jesus went down to Sidon or somewhere like that, pay attention. Or he went to, he heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Like, pay attention to where Jesus is going, because oftentimes this new Joshua is retelling the story of the other Joshua, and he's bringing healing and salvation and good news to places that when Israel went into the Promised Land, where they brought, basically death and destruction to a lot of cities. So Jesus kind of travels the same route and retells a lot of the stories in his retells a lot of those stories within his ministry. Okay, let's take a look here at some key passages in Nahum. Real quick, though, does anybody have anything else? Don't want to take away your opportunity to comment. Yeah, we're not getting through this. Okay, that's okay. Nahum chapter 1, verse 12. This is interesting again. Thus says the Lord, though they are at full strength, and many, that is, the Assyrians, they will be cut off and pass away. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. And now I will break off his yoke from you and snap the bonds that bind you. The Lord has commanded concerning you, your name shall be perpetuated no longer. From the house of your gods I'll cut off the carved image and cast image. I'll prepare your grave, for you are worthless. So notice we kind of go from Judah back to Assyria. You see that switch there again? It's not so plain in the text, but the good news for Judah is there in 12 and 13. All right, so he says, I will afflict you no more. Okay, writing somewhere leading up to 612 BC, the prophet Nahum tells Judah that they would be afflicted no more. Why is that kind of ironic? Why does that maybe kind of stand out to us a little bit? Yeah, what was about to happen 6 years later, basically, at least 6 years later? The first wave of captives would go into Babylonian captivity. A few years after that, the second wave would go. A few years after that, 586 BC, Jerusalem would be destroyed, and the temple would be flattened to Solomon's temple, to never stand again in its beauty as it did in those days. And so when God says, I'll never afflict no more, and then they were afflicted more just a decade later or so, that kind of maybe tells you that this book shouldn't be read so literally. We were talking about that in Proverbs last week, right? That maybe he means afflicted no more by the Assyrians, or maybe this is looking forward to some other kind of restoration, as we're possibly about to see here in a few moments. I just wanted to point out that tension again, how it's just not so cut and dry, Sometimes we avoid these prophetic books because of stuff like this, because how we expect the Bible to behave isn't always how the Bible behaves. How we expect the Bible to act isn't always how the Bible acts. And the things that we expect prophets of God to say aren't the things that they always say.
Even Ezekiel gives pretty graphic in 32 and 32 and 22. It says Assyria is there, all of her company, with their graves all around her.
Yeah.
All been slain, fallen by the sword. Her graves are set in the necessary of the pit, and her company is all around her grave. I mean, there's graves 3 more times, like y'all were talking about, so it might be some concordance or whatever. And anyway, that's just kind of as a visual person,
Yeah.
kind of just an emphasis on all of that.
Yeah.
Even Ezekiel goes to that too.
Now, Ezekiel talks a lot about God's relationship to the nations. Let's look at one more passage here in Nahum chapter 1, the last passage, verse 15. Here we go. Look on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good tidings, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the wicked invade you. They are utterly cut off. Now, obviously, if you're reading this in 612 or before BC, you're going, okay, what happened to this? Because Judah falls a little bit later. The New Testament authors, though, had a different way of interpreting this passage, where, if you look at the back of your sheet, top left corner, where was Nahum chapter 1, verse 15 cited in the New Testament? Okay. Acts Acts 10:36. What else? There should be two others there.
Paul mentions it, although he changes the wording.
Well, probably also quoting the
Not just because it's Septuagint, but yes.
Yeah. And then the other one there, Ephesians 6:15, that your feet be shodden with the gospel of peace, I think, something like that. The key one, though, here is Romans 10:15, where Paul talks about the inclusion of the Gentiles into the covenant and the preaching of the gospel to Israel as being a fulfillment, in a sense, of Nahum chapter 1, verse 15. So Paul sees the fulfillment of this not as being anything in Nahum's immediate future. It couldn't have been, really. I mean, it just didn't happen. They were destroyed, like I said, a decade later. Instead, he sees it as being more something that's fulfilled in the ministry of Jesus, as sort of a transformation of Israel into a new kind of people, an affirming and a fulfillment of the first covenant. Anybody have anything to share on that?
I have something.
You do. What you got, Josh?
I think we should pause and take note of just how incredible this is, because if you've ever tried to publish a book, this is a book that outlasted every other one and has overcome the world, as Daniel says. They filled the world. How in the world did these prophecies come to affect the world like they did? And in answering that question, you have to look at the hope that they give. And a lot of these were even edited. The last edition of these books, the one that we have, was written after all these horrible things took place that you were just saying.
Yeah.
So how in the world can they say that Judah will be restored, even setting it in the narrative right before Judah was destroyed, and then keep saying that with these bigger and bigger promises until you get to Daniel and he's saying the Messiah is going to come, and not only is he going to rule from Jerusalem, he's going to take over the whole world and all nations will pay tribute. What in the world were they thinking? And how did what they wrote even influence before the time of Christ? In the book of Acts, we read that Moses was taught in every synagogue. How did that happen?
Yeah, these.
What did they understand from those messages that were so powerful and yet so lacking in an earthly fulfillment?
Right.
And even on top of that, the messages back then were more transferred verbally. It was always in writing. So he had not just the prophets, but then he had all these other people repeating verbally what the prophet said in the same spirit that the prophet said it. So, I mean, it was, whether or not they agreed to it, that was the story they were repeating. It down passing from generation to generation to generation verbally. So it was more supporting it than going people hearing it.
So, one scholar said, "Hope is like the sun. If you only believe in it when you see it, you'll never make it through the night." Leah Organa. Okay.
Reminds me of the Hebrews passage. Hope is not something that's seen.
Oh, hope, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Is that what you're talking about? Faith. Faith. All right. Anybody else have anything to share on Nahum chapter 1? Okay. Next week. Man, what do I even tell you for next week? Next week I want to look at a few passages in Nahum 2 and 3. But what I really want to do is just point out, I don't know, read Nahum 2 and 3 for next week, but expect something a little bit more engaging than just kind of a verse-by-verse study of Nahum. It'll be interesting. I think you'll enjoy it. But read over Nahum 2 and 3 for next week. And that'll be that. Thank you all for your